Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Smithsonian Gardens. Let's talk gardens. We're so glad to be here with you this afternoon. My name is Cindy Brown. It is my pleasure always to introduce the speakers, give you a little bit of information about them, and then dive into a terrific program. And of course, end it so that you can ask some questions to our speaker. So that's a reminder to put your questions in the chat box, and I will curate them and make sure that we'll get some of those questions answered for you. And we are delighted today to have Steve Dubik. Steve is a professor at Montgomery College, a professor of horticulture, of course. We're not expecting to learn anything about air and space or maybe American history this time. So he's a professor of horticulture, as well as the Master Gardener Coordinator for Montgomery County. So you have lots of experience answering questions, Steve. We're glad to have that. We're glad to get a pulse on perhaps what you've learned from your students and your master gardeners that will be reflected in your presentation. So we know what's going on out there in the world of teaching about horticulture, which is a really important subject to be able to share with. We're always concerned about having fewer and fewer students in horticulture classes. So I'm glad to see you're still there. You still have a job. That's terrific.
Yes.
That's important. But today we're going to learn how to jazz up our gardens with different types of plants. So I'm excited to hear about this. And definitely always my garden can use a little bit of help with jazzing up, as well as I'm sure our audience will appreciate this information too. So why don't you go ahead and take it away? Tell us a little bit about yourself and share your presentation with us. I'll disappear, but I'll come back at the end of the presentation. And as I said, ask some questions from our audience.
Sounds great. Thanks, Cynthia.
Okay.
And thanks everyone. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak this afternoon. And as Cynthia mentioned, I teach at Montgomery College at the Germantown campus. Also the Master Gardener Coordinator for Montgomery County. Work part-time with the University of Maryland Extension. Been doing that for a number of years. And so I teach a variety of courses at Montgomery College. And I've learned, hopefully a few things over the years, and I was going to share a little of that with you. So what I tried to do today is to get a group of plants. I got about 20 plants. We'll see if we can get through all of them today. Spend about a minute or two on each one that I think that may be a little bit underutilized, and they maybe hold a little more promise or potential for folks in the light of a variety of things. We're trying to focus much more on using native plants, native trees and shrubs in our landscape, but we're also aware of some of the pest problems that are out there, and some of the issues and climate change and other things. So that being said, I'm probably just going to go over here and get my screen and share that over with you. I think I got a plant list, and I just gave it to our Cynthia and Zach, our hosts, and I think that might be available for you later on. So I'm going to talk about the plants. I'll try to use the common names mostly, but sometimes a bad habit. I'll slip in, seeing the botanical name as well. So let me get this going. Get this over here, share. I think you got that up on your screen, I hope. And
looks great. Thank you.
All right. Good to hear that. So thanks. So I got my contact information on here on the first slide and the last slide. I put my 2 email addresses up there. As a Master Gardener Coordinator over the years, answered a wide variety of questions. And when I first came there at the University of Maryland Extension, I don't get as many plant samples as questions as I used to, because a lot of folks are finding that information online, but we still accept samples, and we still get phone calls, and time to time we get some things in there I can't figure out. But I've got a really good resources with the University of Maryland Extension to help me out with things come my way I can't figure out. But let me show you my first plant here. So I labeled them, put the botanical name, the family name, just those folks that, so I got Cephalanthus, it's the button bush, Occidentalis. It's one of our native shrubs that are around here. I remember when I started teaching, including this plant in up there at the college, and people would say the button bush, the button bush. Why would anyone want to plant the button bush? Well, I think it's a nice, a native plant. You might find it around here in Maryland and along the banks of the Potomac, the Patuxent and the Anacostia, places like that. It's a shrub that gets 3 to 6 feet, probably even a little bigger than that, I think. Particularly if it has a happy site along a bank or a creek. And right there, I got this is around Tuckahoe State Park near there, and that's in flower. So it may not, be an overwhelming plant maybe, but the flowers are really neat, really interesting looking. It's got really nice, attractive, glossy green foliage. Usually, again, you find it near a creek or stream. Though this one was planted near a bioretention facility. Granted, maybe the fall colors isn't that great. And the fruit will hang around there and, turn brown to black. It can get a little big, but this is why I really like it. I took this one day when I was over at Brookside Gardens, and I got my camera out, and gosh, almost every flower had a swallowtail on it. I missed a few, but anyway, if you like butterflies and you like the big butterflies and you want to attract them, this is a great plant. It's if you get this, they will come. So and at times, it's just loaded with butterflies. So and other pollinators too, not just the butterflies, but bees and other things love to come and visit the flowers on a button bush. So as I mentioned, it gets kind of big. There's a cultivar out there called just cultivars are cultivated varieties, and I know that sometimes people cultivars are. Sometimes people don't like cultivars, like the straight species. The straight species is fine, but one of the problems, it gets kind of big. So there's one cultivar out there that has the trademark name Sugar Shack. And I know it's around in the trade. I'm trying to find one myself because one of the issues, I have the straight species too, and I had several. I've learned over the years they get kind of big, and you have to prune them back a bit, kind of keep them in check. But for a lot of folks that have smaller landscapes, you say, well, that's too big. Maybe this cultivar here might be useful to you. And sometimes, like hearing the term nativars, kind of lets people know that you're working with a cultivar of a native plant. So maybe you can find Sugar Shack, and Sputnik is another one that's around a little bit. So the other one are Sumacs. Sumacs as a whole. And one of my favorite Sumacs is the Staghorn Sumac. We used to have plenty more on the Germantown campus. Unfortunately, we have issues with deer, like many do. So deer do like to eat the sumacs, and it is a big shrub, and it suckers. But I've seen a number of people manage it, also train it to be a small tree, interesting, and put it in a landscape. The sumacs as a whole have excellent fall cover all across. Includes poison ivy too. And the sumacs are male and female plants. So you probably want to get the female plant because the fruit, I think, is one of its major assets. Fall color's great. That fruit's really interesting looking, hangs around through the winter. People take the shoots on this and use them for decorations. It does sucker, will form a colony, but they're shot of the fall color. It is a large compound leaf. When it drops off, the coarse stems there, they're covered with plant hairs. Kind of an interesting look. Sometimes people use those stems for decorations. There's cutleaf cultivars. So the leaf is compound leaf is a little cut, a little more dissected. Kind of has a different textural effect. That one's in the back over. That's over the U.S. Botanic Gardens. So a lot of my pictures actually come. I was mentioned to Cynthia, from places like the National Arboretum, Brookside Gardens, U.S. Botanic Gardens, the Smithsonian. So a lot of them are from around here, the local public gardens. Encourage you to go out and visit. You learn a lot. You see a lot of new things that are trialed out. You go there. This is an older picture just showing you, they can have a wide range of fall color. It's usually really good. And that's the cutleaf cultivar, Lancinata. This one's Tiger's Eyes is the trademark name. It's earlier in the year when it comes out, it's much more yellow, chartreuse look to it. And it's cutleaf too. So it naturally has yellow foliage throughout the growing season. It does color up in the fall nicely, maybe not as well as maybe the species perhaps. And then The other plant, besides the Sumacs, that I really like there's native is this one's a little native, maybe a little farther south, and it's a little bit underutilized, is the southern bush honeysuckle, Durabella sessifolia. So the sessifolia part in Latin means the leaf is like tacked directly to the stem. It's in the honeysuckle family. And normally when you think honeysuckle family, at least sometimes, you think of, the Japanese honeysuckle and these bush honeysuckles. But this is a native one. It's a small yellow flower. Of course, we have our native honeysuckle and Cirrus sempervirens. It's wonderful, attractive vine. But this is a small shrub. It flowers in the summer. And this is more of the picture there to show you its size. It doesn't get real big. And it flowers in the summer at a time of the year where you don't have a lot going on. And this might attract some of the summer pollinators. So when you get in the summer, a lot of the trees and shrubs have done their thing. They've already done their thing. So this is native a little farther south. But we do have, what's interesting, a lot of plant materials that are native farther south, which will grow well farther north, which is maybe a good thing in light of climate change. Some of these plants, I think, will do better if planted in our areas as the climates change. And it's probably interesting over the millennium and hundreds of thousands and millions of years, we've had several different events, ice ages, and plants have moved farther up and farther back. So we do have a variety of plants that are native and in a broad sense. They're outside the Chesapeake Bay watershed, perhaps, but they'll do well here. They'll do well here. And this one doesn't have a lot of pest problems. So this is butterfly. This is in the back. It's kind of maybe used as a ground cover. So I gotta get you. There's some flowers on it, and there are newer cultivars coming out for this too. There's one called Summer Stars. So there's a number of them out there, and I think you'll see more. There's some Amsonia on the one side. One of our native perennials from Arkansas, Amsonia, and then there's a Baptisia. So I think it'd be a good mix. It doesn't get terribly big. Some of these compact cultivars. And shot of the foliage. And of course has opposite leaves like its other cousins in the honeysuckle family. And there's a little closer shot of the flowers. I think you appreciate it more when you get a little closer to it. Sometimes some of these plants that have opposite leaves, when they're growing real fast, sometimes they'll put an extra leaf on there. So you might see 3 sets of leaves. They almost look whorled at times. So there's butterfly a little closer up. But again, it flowers at a time of year where there's not a lot of pollinators. So maybe giving a break to some of the pollinators around here in the summer. So this next plant, Osmanthus, it's not native. Osmanthus heterophyllus. It's a false holly. It's in the olive family. It looks, I think for a lot of people, if you're not aware, it looks like a holly, and that's why it's called false holly. But you can quickly tell it apart from a holly. All hollies have alternate leaf arrangement, and Osmanthus, all the Osmanthus have opposite leaves. The Osmanthus here flowers in the fall, has nice fragrant flowers. It's evergreen. I think I took this over to Arlington Cemetery. So this, it tolerates pruning, it tolerates shearing really well. It's the big thing, I must say, it's deer resistant. So you got a broadleaf evergreen. It has really good deer resistance, has pretty good shade tolerance. Kind of close up there like with American holly, which is our wonderful native plant. And that is good deer resistance too. And I think the Osmanthus is right there, if not right up there with deer resistance. So it does have a fruit. It's sometimes you see it in the spring. So it's kind of interesting. Flowers in the fall, fruit sets in the spring. Often you don't see it. I think it's a number of reasons. Probably the biggest is that we shear this often as a hedge. We'll shear off the lot on the flowers. There's a cultivar called Gulf Tide. This is a picture over at Dunbarton. So it's a good hedge, and like hollies, or like American holly, English holly, and so forth. They have spines on the edge of the leaf, so you get that holly look and that effect. People use it for greens and decoration. Some of the hollies particularly like Nellie R. Stevens, and some of them, they get really bad infestations with some scale called cottony camellia scale. I haven't seen any scale on this. That doesn't mean it can't occur. So scale, they're sucking insects, and there's several groups of scale. There's, armored scale and soft scale. I haven't seen that. So that's one less thing to worry about. It's deer resistant, shade tolerant. I haven't seen it form a lot of seeds. So Gulf Tide's a little faster growing, a little more upright, a little more spiny. There are a number of cultivars, and here's a shot showing the leaf arrangement. Got one leaf there, one over there. So, and the stem is kind of brownish. If that was a holly, at least in the current season's growth, that would be more green or more kind of olive green, or they'd have a different look to it. Most of the time we do shear up the flowers, but if they're around, it's like the end of October. So it's really late in the year when they flower. There's this cultivar called Goshiki. I believe Brookside Gardens helped to get this introduced into the United States. It's sold in the trade. It's a little slower growing. Up at the Germantown campus, I had a little area that we planted outside of an open area where there were deer. And sometimes the deer would browse a little on the Goshiki, but they never really touched the straight species. And they never really decimated it like they did many of my other plants I planted out. So it adds some brightness to the landscape all year round, all year round. That's kind of neat. And there's some other variegated cultivars, one called variegated, but Goshiki does really good cold tolerance. So Devilwood, I put that on. This is native. The Devilwood used to be listed as an osmanthus, but they've reassigned it to a new genus. It's hard to find. This is something maybe you have to go to somebody really a little deeper in selling native plant materials. It's apparently a little difficult to propagate, but I think it's worthwhile to get. It's a native evergreen. It's usually found farther south, Southeast United States, but it does grow here in our area. There's two lovely examples over at Bartholdi Park. They're big. They've been there for years and years and years. They've cut them back a couple of times. They've grown back. So it's maybe something, and it has good shade tolerance. And I've grown one up at Germantown, I don't know, 6-8 years now, and haven't had any problems through our winters. So, and we're a little farther north up in Germantown. But that's one, you see it right there, U.S. Botanic Gardens. I think it's great. Maybe you could use this in lieu of cherry laurels or something like that. Or maybe, I think it's more adaptable than, azaleas and rhododendrons. Of course, you won't get, the floral display like you do on an azalea rhododendron. But I think it's a useful, large evergreen shrub, and I think it has really good potential in the landscape. Few diseases, few insects. Tolerates pruning and shearing. Doesn't have the spines if you don't want that, but you can clearly see the opposite leaf arrangement. So it's been pulled to a different genus, but I still think of it as an osmanthus. There's a good shot right there. So little come. There's a shot of the flowers. Mine finally flowered. I was real happy. So I put Ilex vomitoria on here. This might be a little challenging to grow in the northern parts of Montgomery County. I have one up in Germantown. I've had it for a number of years, and it did get hit. Didn't die, but it did get hit one winter. It wasn't exactly a super cold winter, but it did get some cold energy one year. So it knocked it back a bit. But folks a little farther south, let's say in DC, Northern Virginia, going on down, maybe think about this. It is native farther southeast in the United States. Unfortunately, it has the name vomitoria. And that's kind of a little bit of a bummer. They would make a tea apparently from the leaves. Native Americans and a part of a ceremony. And I guess during the ceremony, maybe people purged or got sick. And so it's associated with that. And so the name, and maybe, I don't know, I think it's underutilized. There's a number at the U.S. Botanic Gardens too to check out. There's dwarf forms. It's an evergreen holly, native Southeast United, not Maryland, has a small leaf. And I think where you could use this in place of, if you can, is the Japanese holly. And I think this, from a distance, for a lot of people, you could use this in place of the Japanese holly. We're starting to see the Japanese holly self-sow a little bit. So maybe this might be a good option. It has attractive fruit. The fruit on the Japanese holly is black. You really don't notice it that much. If you do use a Japanese holly, suggest you buy male if you can. They're often not labeled. At the garden center, sometimes if you ask the the staff there, they might help find that out for you. But I would get a male if you did. So that's a dwarf one there. You can see our hardiness zone. Montgomery County's in 7A. It should grow, but I had it there for a number of years. People use it as hedges. Shears really well. A much smaller leaf, has a little bit of serration on the leaf, but I'm trying to show you the alternate leaf arrangement. Hollies have alternate leaves. Lots of bees visit the flowers. Lots of bees visit the flowers. So particularly if you keep it unsheared, and then you will get a fair amount of fruit. There are, of course, male and female plants. The thing about hollies is it's kind of interesting. The fruit set, you probably need to get a fair amount of light. You could probably, if there are other male hollies nearby, possibly even other species, they're probably going to help with getting fruit set. But you're going to need to get some type of male holly near there to help you get good fruit set and more open location. And so these are upright forms. Will Fleming, it's over at the U.S. Botanic Gardens. We have these sky pencil hollies. I like the sky pencil hollies. Nice, give you this nice vertical accent. This might be an alternative. So the sky pencil holly, that's a pretty common holly we use in the trade, but this might be an alternative, good alternative. Will Fleming. So I'll switch over to Chinese fringe flower. Keep moving along here. So the Chinese fringe flower is in the witch hazel family. It's not native, of course, but it does provide interesting flowers. And some of the older cultivars, especially when at the U.S. Botanic Gardens, a little large, maybe on the large side, middle, maybe kind of growing kind of asymmetrically, irregularly shaped. Many cultivars. They think the trade or the industry has provided a lot more options. Tend to see the flower leaf color much darker. You've got a wider range of flower colors. You've got light pink and darker pink, some that are pretty close to red. There's some that are white, and they're compact ones, some that are really compact. Cold hardiness, I would say, was an issue in the past. I think a lot of the ones they have out there now do pretty good. Probably not the most drought tolerant plant around. So maybe a site that has a little more moisture. Show you going along here. This is one, it is, most of the ones we use in the trade, you're going to see have reddish or reddish purple leaves. It flowers primarily in the spring, but sometimes you get some flowers forming in the fall, a few coming out. You get some irregular growth there, but I think you can easily correct that. A shot of leaves, a little bit of hair on the stems. And there's the show. It has these kind of fleecy like flowers, kind of like you used to see on witch hazels, like the American witch hazel. And it's in the same family, but you do get this range of colors. There's the pinks. I like the ones that are a little more red. There's ever red. There's a bunch of others out there. It just adds a little bit of color to the landscape. I know there's been some studies saying that if you have red foliage plants, either the caterpillars don't like them, or maybe they don't. Butterflies and moths won't lay eggs on those. That's true, but just don't go overboard. Maybe just keep it moderate. How many plants you plant with red foliage? They're the green foliage forms. There's Carolina Moonlight. The white ones maybe not quite as common. This is one that's shown its fall color. This is one I have. I haven't done anything. I haven't shared it ever. Some are fuller and more dense than the original ones I used to see. They were more irregularly shaped, kind of a little crazy looking. We have one up at the Germantown campus that's essentially now become a small tree. We've limbed it up. So cold hardiness is pretty variable, Black Hall Viburnum, one of my favorite native viburnums. So Viburnum prunifolium. This is it right here. There's several selections. There's the Native American Museum in the background right there. I think it's doing a good job showing off. I got these wonderful white flowers, cluster of white flowers. Plus, you get some interesting fruit later on in the year. It's going to provide a good source for pollinators. It's also a good food source for the birds later on in the year. Viburnums have opposite leaves, okay? And some viburnums are evergreen, some are deciduous. We have native ones, we have ones that are not native. But this is one, it is found around the woods around here. The arrowwood is probably a little more common, but the blackall is a good one. Sometimes I get faked out by this. I look at this leaf and it looks like something like a cherry leaf. And I've done this many times. And then I go look at the leaf arrangement. I go, oh, it's opposite. So it's not something like in the rose family. Most things in the rose family have alternate leaves, cherries and things like that. Sometimes I've done mistaken as a cherry from when sometimes people give you just a little sample. You don't see the flowers and the fruit, and you're just looking at the leaves. This is actually over at the extension office over in Durwood, Maryland, Montgomery County Extension Office. This is a native one there. And the fall colors pretty decent. It is just kind of right here on this fence row. It's a little hard to see, but this one's loaded with fruit. And there's some of the fruit right there. There's a couple on our campus up at Germantown too. Then this one's over along this is along the Potomac, over near kind of near Great Falls. So you can see it originally turns red, then it's going to turn to this like a navy blue. And it's more of kind of an emergency kind of food for birds during the winter. It has bark that looks like a dogwood. In fact, when I saw this one from a distance, because of the size and the shape, I figured it was a dogwood. But when you see it, it's a cluster, or like a semi-snowball kind of look cluster of flowers. Take a look. But what I thought was really cool, this is one of our local nurseries in Montgomery County. They're training it as a tree form. And I thought that was, so this would maybe give people options to use a small tree. I love our dogwoods, our native dogs. They have some issues, maybe, put something different in there. I think having a diverse landscape, I think is great. I think you're going to get a broader range of pollinators, insects, beneficials, the more diverse your landscape. Have a large tree canopy if you can, an intermediate tree canopy, a small tree canopy, diverse group of shrubs. You'll attract more variety of wildlife, insects, pollinators. There's a cousin down a little farther south. It's called the nannyberry, and you get it has a little different looking bud. It looks like a duck's bill, so maybe that's a different option for somebody. I have one of each in my yard. Calicarpa americana. There's an American beautyberry. There's a Japanese beautyberry that's out. That's a nice plant too. I like that. But I'm kind of partial to our American beautyberry. It's found a little farther south, but it will grow here. It'll grow here. Over there at the National Garden around the U.S. Botanic Gardens. A lot of fruit. If you want to get some, probably want to get in. It's not really heavy shade tone, maybe light shade. You want to have an open, sunny area. It seems to do pretty good pollinate itself. So even if you have one plant, it seems to do pretty good. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to have two, but I've seen, we just have one up at the college and it's loaded with fruit. It's usually purple. It's big shows its fruit later in the second half of the growing season. It has these pinkish flowers. They're okay. They do attract pollinators. Sometimes they're white. Usually they're pink. There's the fruit. And people, love this for flower arranging. In the fall, the leaves will drop off and the fruit will remain at least for a period of time. And that's kind of cool. It's still probably coloring up there. This has bigger, larger fruit, bigger leaves, thicker stem because it has to support the weight of these larger leaves. And the fruit tend to circle right around where the leaf is as opposite leaves. They're kind of really neat. So, and there's different colors. There's a white one, there's a pink one, there's a red one, but this is just the straight species. And this is, like it. So there's a white one. That one's, I think, is an arboretum. I took that picture over in Northern Virginia. This is, I think it's Welsh's pink. This is around U.S. Botanic Gardens. It's going to color up a little bit more, but it's much lighter color. So I got Baccharis about halfway through. I was trying to keep going, keep on time. So Baccharis, I added this to my plant materials list when I teach at Montgomery College. I was a little bit on the late side. I've come a little bit more fan of this plant because of its adaptability. And the interesting thing, it's in the aster family. Normally we think of perennials and things in the aster, but we got a woody plant here. And this is along Kenilworth Avenue, not too far away from where I live over in College Park, but that's it along the highway. It could have been planted. I guess it probably wasn't. These are male and female plants. They flower late in the year, really late, September, like mid-September, and they quickly put a fruit on. If there are male and female plants, so of course only female plants can have fruit. Some maybe the seeds might be poisonous, but I think for the most part, this is I think a good plant. It's really tough, really tolerant to salt and de-icing materials. So if you're along roadways and highways, maybe the bottom of a parking lot where de-icing materials and road salt might accumulate, if you go along 95, as you go north, you see less of it. But as you go, I would say from like Route 50 on down, or you go along 50 heading east along the eastern shore, it's very, very common plant. It's like the first shrub you see right next to the Chesapeake Bay. So there's a really big one, and that one is up at the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens. So it can grow in our area. It can grow farther north. I don't know if most people can let it get that big, but that was impressive. So you probably want to get the female. It's not much to see, not the greatest shot. I've got two here. I think I lucked out. I got two native plants, and sometimes when you get native plants, they're seedling, and you may not know if they're male and a female. I'm trying to get a male and a female, and I lucked out, and I did. So I got the two side by side. Has a grayish green leaf to it, kind of wedge shape. There's a shot of the flower, and it's what I like about it. It's the time of the year when it flowers. I think it'd be really helpful to some pollinators. There's not a lot of shrubs flowering at that time of year anyway. And there's the fruit. They look like little tassels, little brushes, and they're attractive for a long time, way into November. So it provides a lot of resources, provides a lot of ecological resources. It's maybe a little more on the utilitarian side. I don't know of any cultivars, but I think it's a great plant. If you're doing conservation landscaping, maybe along bioretention facilities and places like that, you might want to look into getting that. Provides a lot of ecological services. I got a vine, an evergreen vine, and it's kind of found a little farther south, you can tell. It's I think it's found maybe up to around as far as up to Norfolk, around Chesapeake. But it grows in our area. Over the years, I've grown it since I was a kid. A couple of times it's got some winter injury, but it's never died completely back. So sempervirens means evergreen, and it pretty much does live up to that. Now, it's not native to Maryland, a little farther south, State Flower, South Carolina. I put a lot of information on this one, but that's over in one of my friend's house, Nina's house over in Bethesda. She has it, and it's really showing off there. It flowers, mid-late spring, kind of around the time when daffodils are kind of out flowering. The King Alfred daffodils are out. Attracts bumblebees, big time. I think the nectar may be problematic to honeybees, but I don't see a lot of honeybees. I do have 2 hives up at the school. I don't see them visiting that much to it, which is probably good because I think the nectar might be problematic to them. Usually see bumblebees on it, lots, and it's fragrant. U.S. Botanic Gardens. In fact, they pruned it back quite a bit since it took this picture. So it's a native evergreen vine. Has fragrant flowers in spring. Maybe something. I know we have wisterias. Maybe of course, step away from the Asiatic wisterias. We have the American wisteria. We have a cross vine, but this might be another option. It's an evergreen vine, and the way it climbs, it's a twining vine. So you may have to help it to climb up an object first, and then it will climb on itself. So if you put it right next to a wall or something like that, it's not going to work. You're going to have to help it up. So weave it through here. This is at I think this is maybe near the Sculpture Garden, possibly. It's downtown. It's around the grounds of the Smithsonian. So yeah, this is a shot of the flowers. And I've been growing this. Since I read about the description when I was taking plant materials when I was in Maryland, I just thought this sounds really nice. And I have a couple at my house. So there's shot of nice, clean, glossy green foliage, looks attractive pretty much all year round. It may darken a little in the winter. That's pretty much it. Opposite leaves, smooth edge. There's no plant hairs or anything like that on it. There's some fruit. I finally got some fruit on mine. I guess I'm okay with that. I haven't seen any little seedlings pop up though. But for years, I grew some and I never saw fruit. But there's one vine in my yard seems to do it, the other one doesn't. So I got Santa Lena. It's not native, and it's kind of one of these plants that is it a perennial or is it a woody plant? Because it has a little bit of a woody understructure to it. But I put it on the woody side of things. I like my lavender cotton. It's also in the Aster family. But what it has going for it, this plant, like a lot of its counterparts, when you think of this lavender cotton, you think of rosemary and lavender. It grows in the same type of environment, full sun, well-drained soils, probably low fertility, little on the higher pH if you can get it. The soils I planted, like we have a bluestone gravel driveway. I planted essentially, I would say there's much more gravel than soil. If you get it past that first year, it'll grow. So it'll grow in really gravelly, not too good soils, full sun. In fact, the problems what I have with it is our spring sometimes are just so wet for so long, it gets too much water. And you actually see it kind of little decline. But when the second half of the summer kicks in, it's hot. It's love and life. You can shear it. Sometimes you do. It has these flowers that look like the center of a daisy with not we sometimes call them petals, but the ray flowers on it. That's nice. And then this is, you could trim it up. There's some right there, trim right there. This is over in Riverdale, over here in Prince George's County. And this is using it kind of, I like it. It's very fragrant. Oh, I forgot to mention, extremely fragrant, very deer resistant. This is one of the plants I feel that confidently you could put out there right where the deer are, and they're going to leave it alone. And it's interesting what they're using here is mulch. This is using crushed oysters shells right there. So yeah, there's a shot of this is actually up in Frederick, this picture. So you might get a little cold injury. Seems doesn't happen that often. I'm more worried about the soils being too wet, too long in our winter or in the spring. So good drainage is a must. Shot of the foliage, kind of interesting looking little leaf covered with hairs. And this one, it's getting a little sprawly. So trying to keep the moisture down, the fertility down, that's actually a good thing. You don't get it going, you don't get this explosive growth. It's better to keep it on the dry, low fertility side. I think you can, although this does look nice, I think too. I prefer to perform the plant. And this is one we had for years. They just right there at the back of the school, we had kind of right next to, right in front of the splash rock here, and it's done really well. It's still there today. Yeah, drainage is real important. So this next plant's maybe, I don't know, haven't maybe seen or haven't heard of this one maybe too much, but I am surprised it's not used more. It was in the lily family, but they moved, I don't know if all or many of the plants in the lily family now, I don't know if you heard this, to the asparagus family. It's shocking to some of us anyway, to me. But so Danae, or the Alexandria laurel, the poet's laurel, it's evergreen. This is behind the Smithsonian Castle. It's right there. And there's several groups of plants there. And it's deer resistant, it's shade tolerant. I've never seen scale or mites on it. So if you want your evergreen shrub, I think it's contrasted well for Japanese cut leaf maple there. If you ever grown asparagus, it has some remnants of the fruit, looks like, or an asparagus fern, maybe an asparagus fern. You see the fruit on your asparagus fern. You kind of see it. People use these for greens. I've used them, plants like this, and you go around, you make a little flower arrangement yourself. Use this, cut some of these and use these for greens for decoration. It has parallel venation, like plants. This is a monocot. It's in the asparagus family, essentially. It's a monocot, it's parallel veins. This one's at Brookside Gardens. It is old. It's like me, getting old up there. It's been there for a long time. this damage right here, it's no fault of its own. It's really due to this right here. This pop-up sprinkler has been hitting it right there. That's what's going on there. But this is the biggest one I know. It's probably, I don't know, 8 feet across, about 4 or 5 feet wide. But that's been there for a long, long time. It's a clump plant, which is good, so it's not going to spread. Same sort of thing here. I've got a bunch of it right there. It's cut back a little here because of the emitter. This is on the grounds of the Smithsonian Castle. Dystilium, kind of a newer group of plants, maybe new to some folks. It's in the witch hazel family, and most of what you see they're crossed for several different species. So it's an evergreen. And the big thing, I kind of broke in, they come in many different, some that are upright, some that are wide, some that are dwarf, we get some dwarf ones too. So it could be used, you could use this in place of a number of other plants. It's not native, but you can use this in place of cherry laurels. Cherry laurels are not native, but we use this abundantly. They get problems with peach tree borer. They also get problem with a scale, sometimes pretty bad. Right now, they don't have a problem, but like many things, if you plant it, wait long enough, probably pests will come. Some of the smaller ones, more compact ones, maybe can be used in place of a boxwood. We boxwood blight. But we do have some new varieties of boxwood out there that are pretty resistant to boxwood blight too. So it may be possible use it for that. It's in the witch hazel family. Flowers really early, not much to see as far as the flowers going. This is over at the Hope Farm. It's a nursery over here in Montgomery County. Use it along here. I saw one used in downtown Bethesda. Downtown Bethesda is as a little barrier hedge and out right in front of one of the restaurants down there. There are a bunch of cultivars. New leaves come out, usually copper colored. There's Blue Cascade. I really like that's really dark blue and really good shade tones, as good as it gets. And it holds those leaves and they don't discolor. And I've had them for years and I haven't had any winter injury on it. It's actually in flower right there. So, not seeing too much of the flowers. This is that's out of focus. It's going on my phone. That plant, I got 2 or 3 in my year. So the Blue Cascade's nice, but there's a bunch of others. There's a shot of the flowers. That's usually March. I'm not sure what pollinators go out, but we do have some pollinators. You get a warm day in March. You've probably seen that. The bees will come out and things like that. So possibly replace it, cherry laurels, especially junipers and some hollies. There's a bunch of them out there. There's one that's called Cinnamon Girl. That's going to probably a little more useful. It's small, so that can be used in smaller landscapes. This one, I think it's Emerald Heights. I just planted it. It's much more vertical, so that maybe could be used as a hedge, possibly. It doesn't have real sharp needles and things like that. But so switching back, got a native here, Austria virginiana, Eastern hop hornbeam. It has a cousin. We have hornbeams. We have the Carpinus caroliniana. That's known as, gosh, a whole bunch of different names. Carpinus, blue beech, water beech. That's found along the creeks and streams. But this one is usually found it's native, but it's rare in Montgomery. It's usually found higher in elevation, higher on the tops of hills. That's a beauty there at the U.S. Botanic Gardens. And it's nice, clean foliage. It's a nice, small shade tree. It's not messy. It doesn't have messy flowers and fruit. The same reason some people like plants is the same reason people don't like plants. Maybe have the fruits messy or attracts bees or something like that. This does not. It has interesting bark. Don't know a lot of the cultivars, but yeah. So like its native Carpinus carolina hornbeam, the leaves look pretty much just like this. It's not the best shot there, but there's our bud shot. That's to help to tell it apart. If you get a picture of the bud between the two, the releases tell them apart. These guys they're wind pollinated. A lot of our native trees, like oaks and things like that, they're wind pollinated. but they do provide a lot of ecological service, their foliage, to a lot of caterpillars and other things. So it may not be the greatest for the pollinators, but it provides a food source for other insects and wildlife. So this is in Bethesda, used as a street tree. I like the size. It isn't going to get terribly big. It's more conducive maybe to, to urban areas. I love our oaks. Planting straight species oaks when you can is the way to go, but also realizing, the space that's available for the roots to grow, urban conditions, power lines, things like that. I think there's a place for looking at some of them. We don't have as many, are smaller to mid-sized native trees. So this is showing you the younger bark. It's going to change quite a bit as it gets older, like I guess we did when we were younger. It looks pretty different. So when you see that bark, you can easily separate it from its cousin. You don't see much around here. You probably have to go to a native plant nursery, probably get a smaller one. There's some of the nurseries are starting to carry it. It's just, I don't think a lot of people are aware of it. Doesn't have a lot of pest issues. Things do feed on it, but it just seems to, nothing that overwhelms, at least I haven't seen it. So the fruit looks like that of hops. And that's where it's got the name hop hornbeam. So cucumber magnolia. Oh, I better try and maybe just do one or two more here, Cynthia. So cucumber magnolia, that's one of our native shade trees. It's a large shade tree, just something a little bit different. Red maples are wonderful trees. Love red maples. I think we've seen a lot of red maples around and oaks. So just giving a little more diverse landscape, attracting some other plant materials. This one's Longwood Gardens, probably bigger leaf than typical. It is a bigger leaf than typical. There's this fall color. Its flowers look like that of a tulip poplar. They're in the same family. So using this plant, it does not get the same pests that oaks and maples get. So we're getting some new pests that are attacking maples coming our way soon. Having a diverse landscape is kind of really big. I think the way to go. And maybe I'll end up with this, probably maybe Cynthia here from keeping track of time. The last one here today, sorry to get all the way through, but the Oriental Spruce. Oriental Spruce, if you like spruces, you probably noticed that our Colorados and Norways are having a tougher time here. They're not native plants. Our summers are getting more hot, humid. We're seeing more disease pressure on it from needle cast. Although they're not native, they do provide some ecological service to birds that are nesting and things like that, and hiding, when they go back and forth between a bird feeder or something like that. So let me show you the Oriental Spruce. It does not get the two big diseases that the Colorados and the Norways get. It's dark green, and the needles are not nearly scratchy. They're real short, they're rounded, does grow well in our area. Something you can kind of look. Mostly what you see is the straight species. There's its cones. So this is when some are narrow, some are wide. Take a look around when you buy them, because they are often grown from seed, so they're going to have different habits. So I don't know, Cindy, maybe I ought to stop there if that's good. I'm not catching Cindy. I'm sorry.
No, I know. Here I am being as bad as I tell other people not to be. I forgot to.
Yeah.
But go ahead and go. You only have 2 more plants.
Okay.
We don't have a lot of questions, so I think we appreciate
All right.
your information.
All right, I'll go. Okay, so thanks. So I'm going to show you the American smoke tree. There's you might be familiar with. I call it smoke bush, and I call this a smoke tree. This cotinus. So there's 2 cotinuses. The one that's a smoke bush is smaller and has purple leaves. Now the American smoke tree is kind of its big cousin. Not a lot of cultivars. They don't have varieties that have purple leaves, but its size is nice, and this is its typical habit. This is over the extension office. It has flowers, small, yellow, but it's not the flowers. It's when the flowers drop off, and it's the seed head that kind of sits around. That looks nice. The bark's okay looking too. It has the potential, because a lot of these are seedling propagated, of having the best fall color, out there, like the Sumacs. So you might get a winner. The leaves are bigger. They're about 2 to 3 times bigger than the purple smoke bush. I like the purple smoke bush. Deer eat it. Deer will eat this. So But once it gets high enough, you got to protect from the deer. You might have to put a fence around the bottom, protect the bucks from rubbing it. Hopefully get some size, showing some of the fall color. That's the one we used to have. I mean, that's great. So it ranges. That's one of the things when you get seedling, you don't know. Maybe the time to shop for it is when it has fall color. There are the flowers, kind of plain. Here's the fruit. Cluster from a distance. That's why it's called smoke bush. It looks nice. So the 7 sunflower, not native, maybe thought was here to replace using crepe myrtles. Oh, I know, love crepe myrtles. I know, but they're not native. But that's, you know, it's a wide variety of colors. Some cultivars self-sow, some don't. But crepe myrtles sometimes get powdery mildew. We get resistant varieties. But we have 2 new pests coming on crepe myrtles. Crepe myrtles aphid, and there's now another scale. So maybe something to think about. It only unfortunately have 1 color, white, but it's a trick plant. So it's going to be white, late season, like crepe myrtle flowers. It's in the honeysuckle family. A lot of bees are attracted to it. There's the bark. It's kind of flaky, interesting, not quite the same as a crepe myrtle. It's okay looking. But that flower head turns pinkish red, and that goes all the way into November. This one's trained as a tree, but this one's more, well, it's still a tree, maybe a little more shrub-like, but that provides late season interest. So this is from August to November. So this is for the late season crowd, folks. It's good. So what's left is the sepals, the lower portion, just like you would see in a glossy abelia. It colors up real nicely. There's a whole row. That's pretty nice. It's up at Ray Melton Farm. And the last one here is the Syringa, or this pinking lilac. And I chose this one. Lilacs get issues with powdery mildew. This one's pretty resistant to powdery mildew. They get issues with borers at times. But I think this is mostly as a small tree. So this instead, it only gets 15, 20 feet tall. So again, in urban areas, under power lines, maybe some options for another use. There's the tree lilac that's out there too. It's its cousin. This has a little smaller leaf, smaller flower cluster, just a different look. It doesn't have the problems like the common lilac. You don't see powdery mildew on it. It doesn't get the borers. It's a smaller leaf, a little finer texture look to it. This is showing my hand. The tree lilac leaf's much bigger. There's everybody's coming to this. You'll see bees, you'll see flies. These are borers. A lot of adult boring insects eat pollen and nectar off this. And so anyway, it's a lot of people don't realize that you get these older, more primitive groups of plants. They're going to attract more of the beetles. The beetles some of these adult beetles need food resources too, a pollen and nectar. So it provides some help to them. There's the seed head. I haven't seen seedlings of it so far. Has a different looking bark, kind of like that of an apricot tree. Kind of looks like a cherry tree kind of thing bark. That's kind of neat. So that was it. I got to the end. Thank you, Cynthia. So
yeah, well, you've shown some of my favorites. Thank you. Heptacodium is one of my very favorites, so I'm glad to see that. And you're right about the crepe myrtles. They're beautiful, beautiful plants. They bloom at a time when a lot of other things aren't, but we are seeing some pests like you do anytime with monocultures. So it's good to mix things up a bit.
Yeah.
You've shown us a lot of good plants to mix things up. And I really appreciate the fact that you say, go out and look at the public gardens. You're using public gardens with your students to be able to show them the different cultivars.
Yes.
Perfect way. If you can't find it at the nursery, which you may not, come to us, come to Botanic Garden, Brookside, wherever else you're going to go, and look at that plant, and then go back and champion your nursery to sell those plants.
Yes.
Some comments where I can't find that. Well, go complain to the nursery. Tell them you can't find it.
Yeah.
Happy customers. So.
Yeah, they want to sell plants. You let them know. They'll piece through the customers. They sure will.
Yeah, and same as if you don't want them to sell something like English ivy that's very invasive, go tell them. They need to hear from you. They need to hear from us. So I appreciate that. I also appreciate the fact that you're emphasizing phyllotaxy. I can tell you're a professor. That's first things that it looks like this, and we always make assumptions, but check
Yeah.
out every part of that plant, look at the phyllotaxy, arrangement of leaves for those that have never used that term before. And so that's just terrific advice. I really
Okay.
appreciate it. Thank you so much
Thanks.
for doing it. One of the questions that I always hear from people, well, is it shade tolerant? Is it sun tolerant? All these different things. And I'm hoping it's still being used, but my favorite reference book of all is Michael Durr's Manual of Woody Landscape Plants. So I'm hoping
Yes.
it's still in the field. Just such a terrific reference book.
That's the one we use. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's very opinionated, so you might
Mhm.
not agree with him.
Yeah.
But it's good to hear advice, just like from you, from our authors as well, so that you can get a well-rounded opinion of the plant before you make that choice, which I is
Great.
good.
Well,
One question that we did have was red leaf plants, and I've heard this before too. Do you know why the cucumber or caterpillars aren't eating it, or why is it not why are they not attracted to our insects?
I don't know. And it's a hunch. The reason I think a lot of these butterflies and moths, they're very visual. And I think the red puts them off. So I don't think they even lay their eggs there. So they go, I'm going over here. I look at if you have my thing, if you have one or two in your yard, red, just don't get carried away. That. But yeah. So maybe having that one, Japanese red maple, but just know that, they as a whole, they apparently they don't like that.
Yeah. I don't know why either. So I'm going to have to ask one of our botanists over at Natural History, see if anybody's doing any research on that. But
Sure.
you have a great answer for put a couple in, put a couple natives in, put a couple, other types of plants in, as long as we know that there's no problems with them.
Yeah.
And that's real important. Thank you for having well-rounded advice.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah. Do you have any information too on cultivars? I like that you're calling them nativars.
Mhm.
I know that many public gardens are doing research on them. Are you doing anything up at Montgomery College to look into if there's any problems with nativars?
No, I'm not really set up to do research. I'm more reliant on places like our public garden folks and like at Brookside and then in National Arboretum. And in fact, I'm going to a conference next week trying to get information like you guys. Yeah. So, but yeah, to hear the word, but I know one place is up there is up there, Mount Cuba. Mount Cuba is doing a lot of work. That's probably where I think you check into. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Mount Cuba is doing work. They publish every year. They do trial plantings to see which plants do well, which one they do a pollinator count, which I think is just awesome. So that they look at those plants and see how many pollinators and what are the pollinators that are going to it. Bumblebees, like you say, love Carolina jasmine, which I do too. Smells wonderful like bubblegum every time that blooms. But yes, it's not favorable to honeybees, but I'm sorry it's not favorable to them, but I'm really glad it's favorable to bumblebees, which are native, and that's really important. I thank you so much for such great information. Do you have any parting words of wisdom? I'm looking at the same time at our questions. You're getting lots of kudos for such great information.
Okay. No, I just want to thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to speak this afternoon, and I appreciate it much.
Okay. Maybe you could do a pitch for our master gardeners and how important that they are to disseminate great information.
Yes. So throughout the country and in Maryland, there's multiple master gardener programs. They have different training programs at different times of the year. In Montgomery County, we're going to do ours a little different. We're going to do it in the summer online, and then I'm going to switch it to go face-to-face, move it around. And some of our counties have regional ones. So, check out just put in the Maryland Master Gardener website, and, you can go and find your local county and send them an email when their training program is coming up. It's a great place to get a lot of information. But our goal is to provide this information so that you can help educate the gardening public, residents, wherever you are, to provide accurate, unbiased information. And we need a lot of help doing that. And we certainly appreciate any of those folks that are interested in joining the Master Gardening Program. Reach out and contact us.
Great. Well, loved hearing from you. Love the information. Thanks so much. And thanks for leading such a great program. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, everyone.
Have a good afternoon and a good spring.
You too. Good. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.